Everybody. We are excited to have you here with us today. My name is Erin Cameron, and I'm the Development and Outreach Coordinator for SACE. I will be the facilitator for today's webinar, Sea Power, the Value of Offshore Wind. On behalf of SACE, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar. Your interest and support make our work possible. For those of you not familiar with SACE, we are a regional organization focused on promoting responsible energy choices that create global warming solutions and ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. SACE has been a leading voice for energy policy to protect the quality of life and treasured places in the Southeast since 1985. We are a membership organization, and we have some SACE members here on our call today, so I just wanted to thank you so much for your support and encourage those of you who are not members to join us today. We will be recording this webinar, so all of the lines have been muted to assure recording quality. I encourage you to type in your questions using the questions option on your control panel. We will then answer the questions in the order they are received at the very end of the presentation. This presentation will also be available on our website, cleanenergy.org. And now I'd like to turn it over to Simon Mahan, SACE Renewable Energy Manager.
Thanks, Erin. Good morning, everyone. This is Simon Mahan. I'm the Renewable Energy Manager for the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Wind energy-wise, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy works on policy, communications, and stakeholder outreach and engagement throughout the region. Today, we're going to be discussing a little bit about some of the research that we've been conducting over here regarding the value of offshore wind energy and nearshore or coastal wind energy. So today we're going to first kind of outline what exactly peak power is, what the sea breeze effect is, and what these things have in common. The reason why I think most folks are probably interested in the topic today, particularly as it regards to offshore wind energy, is historically wind energy has been viewed as kind of a nighttime resource. However, the new research that we're rolling out today with regard to North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia shows that coastal and offshore wind resources have a strong correlation with the electric utility demand onshore. And it helps provide a higher value electricity if these wind farms were developed in those particular regions. So with that, let's go ahead and jump in to everyone's favorite part. Erin, next. Just some disclaimers about the research that I'm about to share with you. We evaluated some data sets from 2006 to 2008, so there may be some variability from year to year if you were to look outside of this time frame for both the utilities that we look at, but also the wind modeling data that we have. We evaluated data from Georgia Power, Progress Carolinas, which is now part of Duke Energy, and Duke Energy Carolinas with regard to their load demand, but then we reverted back to the parent companies whenever we did some cost analysis in the reports themselves. As such, we're using these utilities kind of as proxy utilities for the entire states that they're in. So Georgia Power, of course, with Georgia, Progress Carolinas with South Carolina, and Duke Energy Carolinas in North Carolina. They are approximations and could change from year to year, and the data that we have should not be used without further evaluation by the utilities or by wind farm developers. The data that we do have for the modeled wind farms are based off of offshore models from AWS True Power based on their power curves and weather data, meaning that the power curves that were developed several years ago may be updated now, and the results may be different using a different power curve or weather data. Next. This map kind of shows the modeled wind farm areas that we had previously looked at under an older report that SACE had managed previously, where we looked at some areas offshore for potential offshore wind energy development. So what you're seeing here is the purple or fuchsia boxes are approximately where these proposed wind farms were modeled by AWS True Power. You have Georgia with 3 different areas, particularly off of Tybee Island, which represents about a little over 2,000 megawatts. South Carolina off the Myrtle Beach, Georgetown, Charleston area, a little bit further north in Charleston, sorry, of over 3,000 megawatts. And then North Carolina is kind of split from Cape Fear on up to Cape Hatteras and that neck of the woods with over 3,000 megawatts. Next. So let's talk a little bit about peaking generation, why it's important, and what it has to do with offshore and nearshore wind farm development. Peaking generation typically is a fast reaction type of generation resource that utilities can turn on very, very rapidly to respond to an increasing demand load, particularly during the summertime when the utility requirements are heightened demand. These peaking generation resources are very, very necessary to prevent blackouts and brownouts during these high loads of peak demand, and as such, they can be very expensive. The speed at which the generators are turned on creates some inefficiencies in their use, but also their lack of use throughout the year helps increase the cost of these utility resources, some of them at least. So let's go to the next slide here, where I have a simplistic generation model, and I do want to underscore this is simplistic. It's not meant to be representative of everything, but I just wanted to put this up here for folks to get a little acquainted with the different types of generation that are available to utilities. So at the very bottom, we have what's called baseload power, which typically, if you look on the left-hand side, this is the typical or so-called traditional resources that utilities rely on. And if you look on the right-hand side of the triangle, this is kind of the renewable side of where those resources might fit in this very simplistic model. So again, back at the bottom, we have baseload generation. This generation tends to be turned on, and it's a steady amount of power. It's typically a coal or a nuclear-fired or a nuclear reactor type of generator, and these tend to operate about 70 to 80% of the time, high 80s, low 90s perhaps. Right up from there, you have an intermediate style or intermediate type of generation. This can be like a natural gas combined cycle power plant. Intermediate generation, as it sounds, is used an intermediate amount of time. It's not used all the time like a baseload power plant would be. And as such, they may run somewhere between 30 to 60% of the time. And then at the very top, we have peaking generation. Peaking generation is used in much smaller quantities over the entire year than baseload or intermediate, but this type of resource tends to be combustion turbines, so natural gas or petroleum combustion turbines that you can turn on very, very quickly, but as such they may be a bit more inefficient and burn an awful lot more natural gas or petroleum to get going very rapidly. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we have the corollary renewable resources that could fit kind of into this simplistic generation model. With biomass and geothermal, you can pretty much leave those on for extended periods of time. For intermediate resources, we've got hydroelectric dams that can be used on and off throughout the year to fit the utility's profile. Wind energy is increasingly being considered more of an intermediate resource, particularly from wind farms out west, where capacity factors can reach in the 50% range. And then at the peaking level, we've got solar energy, which of course peaks at the height of the afternoons. Hydro, particularly when it's used during the summertime in the afternoons again, and then wind energy, which is what I'm going to be discussing here with the coastal and the offshore wind projects. Next. This graph kind of provides another kind of simplistic view of these different types of generation resources. This graph is actually from the U.S. Energy Information Administration. It's not my graph, so I do want to give them credit for it. And it's a very good, simple way to look at how utilities plan out which resources they use over the amount of energy required by the grid. So at the bottom axis, you've got 0 to 140. That's based in gigawatts, or how much capacity the utility may need. And then on the left-hand axis, you've got 0 to 300, which is the cost. So it's in dollars per megawatt hour. And what this chart is showing you is that for the first part of the 0 to 20 gigawatts or so of electric demand, the utilities are going to take renewable energy first. And the reason why is because renewable energy like wind, like solar, um, uh, like hydro, they have a very low to zero operating cost, a variable operating cost. And so they take as much renewable energy as they can possibly get when they get it. So what this isn't saying, though, of course, is that the wind doesn't always blow, the sun doesn't always shine, but when it does, the utilities prioritize those resources over any of their other resources. As you move up the curve, you start adding in additional resources like coal and nuclear, your base load generation. You add in a bit of combined cycle natural gas, which is can be again like an intermediate load. It can also be potentially a base load resource. Natural gas, that yellow bit tends to be the the combustion turbine natural gas, and then you move all the way over to the right, which also is the most expensive type of resource, includes a bit of those combustion turbines, but also can include some petroleum generation as well. This chart is not indicative of every utility across the board, but it does generally show how a utility's dispatch curve increases with the amount of energy that they have to supply at a given time. So if a utility only has to supply, let's say, 60 gigawatts of power at a time, they have plenty of resources that they can provide at a fairly low cost. However, once that utility has to supply 100 to 120 gigawatts worth of power, their costs increase fairly rapidly, and that's where we're going to be focusing on with the peak generation resource of this. Next. Okay, so this chart here shows three different kind of time scales with regard to power demand in the South. The utility here is Georgia Power that we evaluated. The green line is the annual average of electric demand over time. The bottom axis from 0 to 24 is the hours, so 0 hour is 12 a.m. and 23 hour is 11 p.m. in the day, and 12 right in the middle is 12 o'clock. So you have this green line that has this nice curve. It's almost like a bell curve that runs through the day. And the left-hand axis is in megawatts. So it's 7,000 megawatts to 16,000 megawatts. But you can see that there's an awful lot of variability from month to month. So we have two different months up here just to kind of illustrate the point. First, we have February, which is in blue, and then we have August, which is in red. And as you can see, the red line, the August average electric demand for Georgia Power is awfully high. It's extremely high compared to not only the annual average, but also sometimes these winter averages as well. This is where peaking generation is most vital for a utility. They have to provide electricity so the grid doesn't fail, doesn't result in a brownout or a blackout. And it can be very difficult for a utility to meet those final megawatts worth of demand in the summertime afternoons. Now, something interesting I do want to point out here is here in the South, we do tend to have double peaking loads in the winter as well. And that's what the February curve is really showing here, that at about 7 a.m. in the morning, and starting at about 5 a.m., a little bit before 6 there, the demand really tends to go up quite high and fairly rapidly. Then it starts to taper off during the middle of the day and then peaks up again in the later afternoons. This is more than likely due to the increased amount of electric heating in the South. People are waking up in the mornings, realizing it's cold whenever they step on their hardwood floors, and saying, oh gosh, I need to turn up my heater. So they do, and then they start to taper them off as the day starts to warm up. And then at night, whenever the cold starts to show back up, they turn back on the heat, and they start preparing supper and all of these domestic activities. But during the summertime, the predominant activity that's going on here throughout the day is homes and businesses are trying to keep cool. They're running the air conditioners, and they are doing it when it's the hottest in the afternoon, which tends to be around the 2 to about 6 p.m. range. Next. So what we did was we looked at these utilities, Progress Carolinas, Duke Energy, and Georgia Power, to find out when the highest usage of megawatt hours from these utilities was. And what we found was pretty standard across the board, that in South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia, the most peak generation usage tended to be in August, when it tends to be very hot. You also can see from these charts that June and July are also quite used time periods, but also there's some peak generation required and some top hourly demand load occurrences even in the wintertime, so January, February, December, and sometimes varies throughout the year. These can change just based on the weather conditions that are going on. So the years that we looked at were 2006 to 2008. We had a fairly cold winter or a fairly cold spring starting up, so these figures could be changed fairly drastically, but nevertheless, we have certainly returned back to our warmer climates here in August, and especially here in Louisiana. So the point I wanted to make here is it's the most important to try and look at what is going on during the most important month for some of these utilities, which appears to be August. Next. All right, so now that I've kind of set the stage on what peaking generation and peak demand is, I wanted to kind of change focus a little bit and talk about the sea breeze effect and what it means and what the phenomenon is, and then we can kind of we can draw from that experience. So during the summertime, what happens is the land and the ocean they heat up at different rates. And so what happens is, as the afternoon starts to wane on and the sun has been beating down on the land radiates heat at a greater rate than what the ocean does. The ocean is absorbing more of the heat than what the land is. And so you're getting a strong hot air mass over land that likes to rise. Hot air likes to rise. And so what it's doing is it's creating a vacuum over the land that wants to be filled somehow. Well, the cold air, which is denser and it's lower to the ground, moves from the ocean over to the land. And so what you're getting is around 3 p.m. in the afternoons, if you're at the beach and it's been a very hot day, what you should be getting is a breeze coming from the ocean, so a sea breeze coming from the ocean. And it's a fairly steady phenomenon that happens pretty much in any coastal area. It can also happen the other way, where if the temperatures over land cool down much more rapidly than over the ocean, let's say the ocean is quite warm from a long day, but some nice cool thunderstorms have come by and cooled down the land fairly quickly, you can also get an opposite effect, where it's kind of a land breeze effect, where the breeze is coming from the land and out into the ocean. But this is just a general synopsis of what the sea breeze effect kind of looks like and how it kind of operates. Next. Now, there has been some anecdotal evidence of this phenomenon being captured by wind farm developers in different parts of the country. So in Texas, this is probably the best example of it. Texas has historically been building wind farms in the western part of the state, far, far away from the coast. But here fairly recently, within the past 2 or 3 years, the developers really started looking at the coastal area a bit more and installing wind farms in the coastal zone. By doing that, they've actually been capturing the sea breeze effect. And in 2011, as this article highlights, there was actually a bit of distress throughout the entire state because generators were failing, and not just not the wind farm generators, but actual coal plants and natural gas facilities were overheating and just shutting down. So when the grid there in Texas needed more electricity, what was found was that the wind farms in the coastal zone of Texas were supplying a significant amount of electricity based on their capacity. So they were providing more electricity than what many of their onshore counterparts were in the western part of the state, And really, the system operator of the Texas grid credited coastal wind farms for helping prevent a blackout through the state. The other piece of evidence that we've got here is a proposed offshore wind project called Cape Wind. And if you've been paying attention to offshore wind developments, Cape Wind is the first proposed offshore wind farm in the United States. Well, they've had a meteorological tower set up in Nantucket Sound in the water off of Massachusetts for several years. And what they've noticed is year after year after year is that when the peak demand is occurring onshore in the Massachusetts area, the winds are also pretty darn strong during that time as well. And so the Cape Wind Associates have put out several white papers of stating that had Cape Wind been built, that the wind farm would be generating electricity at a high output capacity during those times when the system operators need it the most. So both of these pieces of anecdotal evidence got us to thinking, wow, maybe this is a bit more ubiquitous than just in Texas and up in Massachusetts. And that's indeed what we ended up finding. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide here, where we kind of delve into some of the details of the wind farms that were modeled and some of the output that we've seen from these models. So what I've got here is 6 different months of capacity factors with the proposed wind, the model wind farms off of Georgia. I also have a slide for South Carolina and North Carolina as well, so don't worry, I'll get to your state soon. But we've broken them up basically into wintertime high demand and summertime high demand. If you fall outside of these times, generally the weather is a bit nicer, so folks don't have to rely on their air conditioners nearly as much, and utility demand might not be as high. Of course, that changes to year, but this is generally the 3 months in the winter and 3 months in the summer that we wanted to look at. So what you're seeing here is along the bottom axes for all of these is, of course, the time from 0 hour to 2300. Again, with 12 being noon there in the middle. With the wintertime capacity factors of the wind farms, what we're seeing is that the wind farms are generating an awful lot of electricity in a fairly steady amount. There's not too much variability from the wind farms based on the average output over the course of a December day that we're seeing here. And they're acting pretty much like an intermediate electric demand load resource, or potentially like a baseload resource that utilities could rely on and depend upon a bit more than say some other more variable resource. One other quick thing I do want to say about the wintertime resources here out of the Georgia model that we have is there are 2 little peaks that you're seeing here in around the 6 a.m. hour and then also around the 6 p.m. hour. These may be because of the sea breeze effect. They're too small to really tell, but do notice that they do coincide with some of those peaks that are occurring at our utilities during the wintertime. Again, the utilities tend to have a wintertime early morning peaking and then an afternoon peaking situation as well. So that's kind of an interesting thing to take note of. But the more interesting and most important piece of the puzzle here is what's going on during the summer. So if you look at the June capacity factors, the July capacity factors, and the August capacity factors, you see a fairly large double peak sea breeze effect going on here, where the sea breeze effect is most strong in the afternoons. The winds are picking up in the afternoons in the coastal zone, and that's a very good thing that utilities can use. It's a high value electricity that these wind farms would be providing at that time. Overall, you see that the capacity factors in the summer tend to be a bit lower than in the winter. They tend for Georgia to be in the upper 20s to low 30s during the summertime, but during the wintertime, of course, they're reaching in the 30 to 40% range, and the annual average is around 37%. Real quickly on the capacity factor issue, capacity factors are a way to determine how much electricity a wind farm could be generating over the course of a year. What we've done here is we've looked at an hourly basis. And so let's say a 50% capacity factor for a 100 megawatt wind farm would be expected to have an output of approximately 50 megawatts of power. If it's a 20% capacity factor for 100 megawatts, it would be expected to put out 20 megawatts of power. So it depends on the size of the wind farm, but the capacity factor is really how wind farm developers determine how to value their projects. And in Georgia, it's a compelling story that these capacity factors match pretty closely what the utilities need when they need it. So let's move on to South Carolina here. And as you'll notice, the graphs don't really change all that much. The South Carolina and the Georgia capacity factors and really the wind speeds are quite similar because they're quite similar in groupings, meaning that the wind farms that we looked at in Georgia were really close together, and right offshore, the South Carolina wind farms are pretty tightly compact that we looked at. So the resources are fairly similar to one another. One thing I do want to note here, of course, is that the capacity factor up in South Carolina is indeed higher than what it is in Georgia, but of course Georgia's capacity factor is still pretty good. In South Carolina as well, I wanted to also point out the wintertime months, especially if you look at, let's say, February here. This tends to be more indicative of what traditionally utilities have seen as a wind resource, that the winds are blowing late at night and not so much during the day. But as you can see by, again, the summertime capacity factors, you're getting the benefit of that sea breeze effect. So you're having a peak in the morning and then a peak in the afternoon as well when you need it the most. Generally, what you're seeing over the summertime here is capacity factors in the 30s or 40s, again, which is slightly better than what it is in Georgia, but certainly not bad for Georgia. Next. And the story continues here for North Carolina, where the capacity factors are higher still yet from South Carolina or from Georgia. And generally what we've seen and what maps have shown is that North Carolina does have a better wind regime than these other states, but these other states do have a fairly good wind regime as well. Here you'll also notice particularly in December, North Carolina capacity factors are anticipated to be relatively flat, but in the 40 to 50% range. That's a fairly high capacity factor and a fairly steady resource that the utilities could more so depend on, much like they would an intermediate generation resource or a baseload power plant. And you do see a little bit of two small peaks in the wintertime, but not nearly as much so as what we had in Georgia. The interesting thing here is when you get down to the summer months that the peaks tend to flatten out a little bit. You don't have nearly, excuse me, you don't have nearly the strong sea breeze effect in August as what we've had in South Carolina and also in Georgia, but this is actually because the wind farms that we evaluated were in completely different regions, effectively in Georgia or in North Carolina. We had one wind farm that was at the extreme south end of North Carolina, and then two fairly large ones in the northern portion of the state. And so, whenever you aggregate these regional resources, you tend to flatten out the line a bit more. But nevertheless, there are two peaks that you do see, especially in July, starting early in the morning, and then another one in the afternoon. Next. So the capacity factor charts are all well and good, but what you really need to do to evaluate the usefulness for the utilities is overlay those capacity factor outputs on an hourly basis to the utilities in those states, and then you get a really interesting story. So what I've done here is I've looked at June, July, and August, which again we've established are some extremely important months typically for utilities to provide load demand to, peaking generation to, and I've applied just a very simplistic statistical tool called correlation. And correlation shows that on a scale of -1 to a +1, how well two data sets align with one another. A positive correlation, so 0 plus on up to +1, indicates that there is a positive relationship. A positive relationship means that the two numbers tend to coincide fairly well with one another. And the higher you get up with the correlation, the better that correlation is. So a +1 is perfect correlation. They move exactly in tandem. A 0 means there is no correlation at all, and a -1 means they are at complete opposites. If one goes up, the other one goes down just as much. But what we're seeing is overall, for the summer months, we do have positive hourly correlation for each one of these months in Georgia. We have positive correlation, of course, in June, July, and in August. It tends to be a little bit stronger in August. And then what we also did was we looked at the daylight correlation, so the hours between 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. These are the hours that might give a utility a bit more stress, that they're trying to provide more electricity than what they're normally doing so. And if you look at the daylight correlation, it tends to be even higher still. And so the correlation is good for offshore wind and near coastal wind resources for Georgia electrical demand. Overall, what this is meaning is that these resources can provide peaking generation and do so at such a fashion that it may make it so that the utilities don't have to rely on such expensive generation resources like natural gas combustion turbines. We're not necessarily suggesting that the utilities would have to get completely rid of those resources, but because wind energy relies on a free fuel, you can predict how much those electric costs are going to be over 20, 25 years, and it's a predictable, reliable source that's providing electricity at a high value time. As you'll also see here, it would be interesting to note, and something that we're certainly tossing around, is what other resources could fit in some of these valleys here during the noontime hour. And of course, solar would work perfectly here, where solar is generating at peak demand right around noon or around 1 p.m. And so we're going to be looking at some of those resources and results here in the next couple of months or so. Let's move on. Thank you. Again, these are just the South Carolina results. The green line, again, is the capacity factors. What we've done here to sync them up, is we've taken the peak of the capacity factor for those particular hours, and we've made that the 100% output, the 100% of peak wind generation to help line up between the percentage of peak utility demand and then the percentage of peak wind generation in order to put them on the same level. If you didn't do that, what you'd see is there would just be a very small thin line running across the bottom of a very high utility peak demand bar chart here. But again, what we're seeing here is that we're getting good correlation from the summertime months from the offshore and coastal wind farms with the utility that we looked at there in South Carolina. The results in South Carolina tend to be better in terms of correlation than in North Carolina or South Carolina. You're getting up into the 0.54 hourly correlation for August. The daylight correlation in June is substantially higher, and so these are good resources, particularly for South Carolina if you're looking at Progress Carolinas. Next. And then, of course, we have North Carolina here last. So again, you can see here that the peak wind generation percentage is following pretty darn closely to what the utility needs when they need it the most. And again, the hourly correlation that we're seeing here is positive. It is going in the correct direction. It's a good hourly correlation. And then particularly, again, the daylight correlation is better than the overall day-long 24-hour correlation. We're seeing capacity factors decrease slightly into August, but that may be countered by the fact that the correlation is particularly good during the daylight hours. Next. So here's some of the conclusions that we've come from this research. First and foremost, that the sea breeze effect is clearly available for the South, especially during the hot summertime afternoons. The offshore and nearshore wind resources, they can provide a valuable peak power and thus potentially keep rates in check if the utilities decide to use a coastal wind project or an offshore wind project. The high value of the power that these projects would be putting out make them more valuable, and as such they need to be valued as that way to make them more profitable and better offset some of the costs. And these resources could be used to help utilities meet the peak demand, and so they need to be valued as a peaking generation resource. So instead of comparing a brand new offshore wind farm to an old coal-fired power plant, they need to really be comparing them a bit more apples to apples with brand new peaking generation resources and value them accordingly that way. Next. And that's what we've got. The full reports are available online. We just published them this morning. They're available independently each for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. There's an awful lot of information in each one of those reports, so if you have any interest in this topic, I'd highly recommend that you pick those reports up and read through them. There were an awful lot of suggestions of what else we could do with this, and there's an awful lot left to be explored, so if you have any ideas, please let us know. It was just a daunting task to begin with to sift through all the data, so we didn't want to make it too difficult for common readers to sift through things and to look at the analysis. We thought it was pretty exciting, so we wanted to make it more accessible to folks. And like I said, the reports are available online for North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And with that, if anybody has any questions, I'm available to answer them. Erin?
Great, Simon. Thanks so much. We do have a few questions that have come through, and I encourage everybody else on the call, if you do have questions, just if you came in a little late and missed how we were handling the Q&A session, if you could just type in your questions, we will answer them as we receive them. So the first question I have here is from Michael. What distance offshore and at what height is the Met Tower located that is indicating peak production for Nantucket Sound?
Oh, that's a good question. That project, I think, well, depending on where you are from shore, I think it ranges anywhere from about 7 to 11 miles offshore from the project perimeter, and then you would probably have to go maybe a mile or two more to get to the middle of the project, which is where I think the Met Tower for Cape Wind is located. So it's actually in the middle of Horseshoe Shoal there in Nantucket. So it's not too far offshore. But generally, the broader question is how far does this effect go out? It does, as I tried to establish here, it does. It's clear from our data from the offshore wind models that it is coming from offshore, but there's a certain distance inshore that it will also go as well. And generally, what I've heard, particularly from coastal wind developers, is they're seeing the effect up to 20 miles inshore. So it's potential that it could be 20 miles offshore as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Simon. And I apologize if there's a little overlap with some questions here. We have another question here from Kurt. Do the ocean tides affect the sea breeze effect at all?
That's a good question. I'm not exactly sure, but what the research has shown is that it's fairly steady that we do get the sea breeze effect early in the morning and in the late afternoons during the summertime. And so any variability that there may be because of the tides is likely to be overcompensated for by the sea breeze effect itself. Depending on where you are with the tides, tides don't rush in for miles, or at least they don't tend to rush in for miles. So I don't think there would be that big of an effect from the tides, but I could be wrong about that.
Okay, we have another question here from Dennis. Have the studies examined the loss of generating capacity due to hurricane damage, since all the states in question are prone to tropical storms?
No, we didn't look at that, and there's an awful lot of vigorous debate going on regarding hurricanes and wind turbines. In a separate issue, we've looked at this issue a bit more in depth, and what we found is that wind farms they tend to be designed to be built for up to a Category 3 hurricane, and that's a direct hit Category 3, so it doesn't count if the hurricane is a Category 3 in the eye or near the eye, and the turbines get nicked by some further outside thunderstorms. That doesn't count. And once you start looking at that, it depends on the engineering of the turbines, but also the insurance of the turbines. And generally, what we believe is that the turbines that are designed to withstand up to a Category 3 storm, they could be insured for loss prevention, but you also have to keep in mind anything that is on the coast is at a risk of hurricanes, whether that be homes or businesses or other power plants. We do have power plants that are coal, nuclear, natural gas that also exist on coastlines. Those too are also at risk from hurricanes as well. So wind turbines aren't necessarily a unique resource that are at risk of hurricanes, and certainly if a Category 5 storm is bearing down, there's very little chance of hardly anything surviving from that type of storm.
Okay, Simon, we have another question here from William. North Carolina has an RPS. Is this making offshore wind happen?
Not yet. The RPS in North Carolina is moving that state towards having more renewable generation, but offshore wind is just now really starting to get its legs under it for North Carolina, having recently designated some areas offshore for potential development.
Okay, great. Let me see here if we have any additional questions. Okay, I think you may have covered this a little bit, Simon, so you can just mention that. But we have a question here from Housley. An important factor in all this, how much will the offshore wind power cost on a dollars megawatt basis? And what incentive will there be for a utility to buy it if there is no state or federal RPS?
Sure, great question. The value of well, first and foremost, these reports are meant to highlight the value of offshore wind, not necessarily to establish the cost of offshore wind. There's still a big question as to how much offshore wind farms cost. There have been some estimates, but the Department of Energy does have a goal of having offshore wind farms reach about 10 cents per kilowatt hour by the year 2020, and further into 2030 of having offshore wind farms provide power at 7 to 9 cents per kilowatt hour. Those might be a little ambitious, but nevertheless, the developers for onshore wind farms have certainly met those and beaten those. So if you're comparing between the coastal wind farms, which are onshore wind farms, and offshore wind farms, sure, offshore wind farms may be a little bit more expensive, but at the same time, like I've been showing here, that the sea breeze effect does provide a higher value for those projects. So it's a good question to ask. Unfortunately, I don't have the answer because I'm not a developer, but certainly if you wanted to follow up, I might be able to put you in touch with some folks.
Okay. If we have any additional questions, we'll wait just maybe a few seconds here, see if we have any others come through. And if not, we will wrap it up. Okay. Well, thanks, Simon, for sharing all this information with us. And thanks, everybody, for attending today and for your thoughtful questions. We are really excited to offer this monthly webinar series to everyone. It's a great way for us to connect with you, our members and supporters, on these critical issues we care so much about. The presentation and the recording of today's webinar, as we mentioned, will be posted on our website, cleanenergy.org, via our webinar archive page. Thanks again, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Yep.